So after demonstrating our understanding of the basic needs of living things and that living things find what they need to grow and reproduce from their environment, we're going to start looking at how do living things interact with each other. And those interactions are at the level of population and communities in ecosystems. So those interactions are extremely dynamic. So today we are learning about the dynamics of natural population. By the end of this lesson, you should be able to describe what population growth is. You will see that population grow either exponentially or following the logistic model. Those type of growth describe how many new individuals are added in populations. You should be able to define the critical number and the carrying capacity of a population, explain how organisms interact and the role of keystone species in ecosystems, explain how population change through adaptation and evolution. Remember that evolution is at the core of biology. And then explain how ecosystem resist disturbance, such as invasive species. So on Tuesday, you should have done your exam, number 1. If not, you need to catch up as soon as possible in Blackboard. And then I'm going to introduce you to the dynamics of natural population through this small mini lecture. And then you guys are going to work on a case studies. You're going to study the case of the wolf of Yellowstone. And then it's recommended that you read chapter 4 and then demonstrate your understanding through homework. So what is dynamics of population? Dynamics of population is a term that describes how population change in terms of number over time. So let's look at an example because those numbers really reflect what is going on in the ecosystem. So we're going to look at the example of the African savanna elephants. It's a species that is today declining. How do we know? Well, first we can look at the numbers. African elephant used to be in the early 1900s 3 to 5 millions. And today they have declined. The estimate number is somewhere between 450,000 to 700,000. The decline is due to habitat loss, poaching, climate change, and conflict with people. So in the 70s in Africa, you had a lot of wars that really was detrimental to the wildlife. So elephants, we know they are declining. There is a lot of effort today to try to make the population rebound. And the decline in the ecosystem is also changing not only the population of elephants, obviously, but also the population of other organisms. So, for example, the Sodom apple, it's a shrub, and it is spreading across the savanna. The shrub or the fruit is actually very toxic for many grazing animals. So those grazing animals include the zebra, but also livestock. So this has an economic impact for the local population. Since it's so toxic, local population have been trying to eradicate the shrub. However, it's not working very well because it's extremely costly to eradicate. Among organisms who can consume the Sodom apple is the elephant. Elephants and impala can eat the Sodom apples. And when they browse on it, they can actually help reduce the weed and make more grass available for livestock. So really, for people raising livestock, having elephant around is actually a huge benefit. So the effort that aim at making the population of elephant rebound really illustrate how protecting one species, for example, the elephant, can create a win-win situation for both conservation and for the pastoralist livelihoods. So today there is a lot of effort. We understand, ecologists understand better the role of the elephants in the ecosystem. They are not always something that is negative. In many instances, the elephant is seen as a brother that is really competing with the livestock. But the fact is that in ecosystem, it plays a lot of very important roles. And so if we are changing a little bit our understanding of ecosystem, if we are better understanding how ecosystem works, we can actually, by protecting the elephant, make life of the people who live there much better. So now that we've seen the example of the elephant, we understand that organisms, when they live in an ecosystem, they have to interact not only with the organism of their own species, but also with organisms from other species. So we're going to define a few terms here. Population is a group of members of the same species living in an area, and community are the population of all the different species that live together in an area and interact together. So population can grow with the birth and immigration, and they shrink with death and immigration. So for a population to be maintained in an ecosystem, the number of individuals in that population should not fall below what we call the critical number. So the critical number is extremely important. It prevents biodiversity loss. So what we call the critical number in a population is the minimum population, the minimum number of individuals that allows that population to survive and recover. So when we think about the critical number, we can think about things like a pack of wolves, a flock of birds, a school of fish, or an elephant herd. We all get a sense that we need a certain amount of individual in order to have the production of the next generation. So the group is absolutely necessary to provide protection and support for its members. You have to have interaction between the member of that groups. And then those groups within one population, within one species, if you have different population, you also need interaction between those groups. If a population falls behind this number, the surviving members become more vulnerable. Breeding typically fails, and once breeding is failing, you have extinction. So how do we get below the critical numbers? Quite often, it's a result of human activities. We know that we are changing habitats for many species. We accidentally introduce alien species or invasive species. Pollution is a huge concern. Hunting and poaching is also a huge concern. Our activities are not density dependent. That means when we typically change an ecosystem, it changes all the species. It doesn't matter if one species is more abundant than another ones. But usually when we have some kind of activity in ecosystem, we are changing the whole ecosystem. We're affecting all the population of all the organisms in that ecosystem. So the Endangered Species Act, we talked about it last time when we discussed the IUCN. The goal of this act is to really help for recovery threatened species that we know have populations that are declining pretty rapidly, and then the endangered species. We know that the species are already very close to the critical number. So what is population growth? Population growth is defined as a change in population size. So in some instances, this change is positive. That means the population is growing. And other time, that change is negative. That means the population is decreasing in number. You are at equilibrium when the number of births and individual that we gain by birth and immigration equals the number of individuals that we lose by death and immigration. At that point, you have a zero, but quite often population growth is not a zero, actually, in ecosystem, because ecosystems are changing all the time. So earlier we described how civil wars affected the African continents. Here we can see an example in the Kruger National Park. It's right there in South Africa. This park I've also seen a lot of civil war in the 70s. And as you can see here on the population growth chart, before the 70s, the population were increasing, and then we had decades of war, at least a decade, and then the population rebounded due to effort for preservation with up and downs. And then now in the 2000s, it seems like the trend is really upward, going upward. So when you want to describe how a population grows, you want to use what we call the population growth rate. You divide the population that has changed by the amount of time that it took for the change to happen. So those type of graph or curves or line graph, they show how population grow, and they're used to determine could grow, how fast it could grow, and then what the population might be looking at trends in the future. So when scientists or when ecologists study how a population grows, those populations typically follow three models, or more specifically two models. One is generally not found in nature. That's your constant growth. It's the easiest way of representing a population, but it's not really realistic. In that model, the constant growth, you have a regular and you have a constant number of individuals that is added over time period. So this number remain constant and the number of individuals increase over time. This model, however, pretty much does not exist in nature. What scientists are observing in nature are population growth that either follow what we call the G-shape curve or the sigmoid curve. So let's talk about the G curve, the G-shaped curve. This curve is basically representing exponential growth. You have pretty much the population where the organisms are reproducing without any limitation. And so those populations grow extremely fast. This type of shape is typically used to represent population growth that is explosive. However, this type of growth cannot be sustained indefinitely. At some point, the ecosystem is gonna meet a limit. And then when that happens, when the ecosystem starts to be limiting for that population, something is going to cause or is going to make the population crash. The logistic curve, on the other hand, is when the population has reached the maximum number of individuals for that population in a given environment. So this type of growth is a bit slower, and then you reach the maximum number that we call the carrying capacity, or K. So carrying capacity, K, is the maximum number of individuals in a population. At this point, you don't have any more growth in the population. The rate is 0. So when do we have the situation? When do you have a G-shaped population growth? So you get the G-shaped population growth, for example, when you have an invasive species, and then this invasive species is coming into a new ecosystem, basically doesn't have any predators or doesn't have any microbes or anything to control that population, any disease or any predators or anything like that. And then at some point, that population is going to reach, is going to meet its limit, and it's going to completely crash. The sigmoid model or the S-shaped model, this happens when you have a population that has established complex relationship with other organisms in the ecosystem. And then when you actually look at the numbers do not stay stable at the carrying capacity. The number of individuals some years are going to be a little bit higher, other years a little bit lower. So this G shape, it might be followed by a crash, or if there is some kind of system that regulates that population before it reaches the crash, you may see the carrying capacity as well being established. So stable population is the result from interaction from biotic potential, what we call biotic potential, and environmental resistance. So what is biotic potential? Biotic potential is the number of offspring that can be produced under ideal conditions. So offspring is anything like birth, eggs being produced, number of seed in plants, number of spores in, let's say, fungi. It is measured by a rate, the rate at which the organisms reproduce. And then depending on the species, this can vary tremendously. The biotic potential can vary. You have some mammals who produce less than Y youth every year. And then you have other organisms like plants and invertebrates that can produce millions of offspring every year. The recruitment is the stage when an organism has survived and then it can become part of the breeding population. So young offspring must survive first before it can reproduce and before it can have any effect on the population size. And then factors that affect the recruitment can be abiotic or can be biotic. You can have predation, for example, for biotic factors, or you can have abiotic factors such as very cold temperature that can impact survival of the youth. Those biotic factors are part of what we call the environmental resistance. It's anything in the environment, so again, that can be biotic or unbiotic, that can limit the population increase in numbers. So again, this can be anything biotic, predators, parasites, lack of food, or abiotic, change in temperature, change in light, change in salinity. So environmental resistance are basically your limiting factors, and they can also lower the reproduction rate, so lower the biotic potential of a population. For example, when you have loss of habitation, pollution, or something that is forcing the animal's migration to change. So typically all three are due to humans' activities. Those are part of environmental resistance. So organisms typically have two types of reproductive strategy. How do they make their youth? Some species or some organisms reproduce by producing a lot of offspring, and other species reproduce by investing a lot of energy into the survival of their youth, and therefore have a lot less offspring. So the species that reproduce by producing a lot of offspring are called air strategists. They produce a lot of young, but they let the young basically survive on their own. So there's very low recruitment, rapid reproduction, and movement. The lifespan is usually very short. Those organisms have the ability to adapt to a changing environment. You often see the boom and bust population. That means at some time you have a very low number of individuals. At other times you will suddenly get a lot of individuals all at once. Those species are typically opportunistic. They will get anywhere where they think they can survive. And then good examples are typically your housefly, your dandelion, your cockroach. Those are definitely air strategy species. And then the case strategy species, on the other hand, they have a much lower biotic potential, so they don't reproduce as with such a high rate. They care and protect their young. Their environment is typically very stable. You usually have a lot of different species, and that species, that case strategy species itself, is also very well established. So you have a lot of individuals in that species. You see the case strategist in larger and long-lived, very well adapted species. So those species typically do not adapt as fast to changing environment. Their population are typically around the carrying capacity. We call them also the equilibrial species. And a very good example is, in addition to the A and K reproduction strategy, simply by looking at the life history of an organism, you can pretty much predict what the survivorship of that organisms will be. So the life history, what we call the life history, is things like the age at first reproduction, the length of life. If we look at organisms, let's say like us or like the elephant, we know that the youth survive. And then most organisms in the population can have a pretty long life. Other species, so this type of curve for survivorship is called the type 1 survivorship curve. The type 3, in contrast, the type 3 survivorship curve, you have organisms that produce a lot of offspring, and then a lot of that offspring is also going to die very, very young. And so we never reach the reproductive stages. That the oyster is a very, very good example of that type of survivorship. And then you have organisms that are in the middle. You have a very good number of offspring, but quite a few are going to die young. For the organisms that make it to adult stage and reproductive stage, those organisms typically can live several years, 5 to 10 years, sometimes even more. So type 2 survivorship, definitely the squirrel is a good example of it. Help us understand what that is. So how can we interpret that in terms of response to disturbance? Those species, you can pretty much predict their response to human activity. The air strategists, which are typically type 3, those species can become pests to humans. You want to think about housefly, dandelion, cockroaches. Once, if humans are changing their ecosystem, they can become really damaging to the structure that we put in place. The case strategist, so you want to think about organisms like the elephant or eagles or bears, even oak. Those organisms, when humans are changing their ecosystem, they can quickly become at risk of extinction. So now that we understand how to describe population, we're going to start asking other questions. Why does a population grow? What limits the growth of a population? And what regulates the population growth? So why does a population grow? A population grow if there is a good biotic potential, so the ability to reproduce, and then the environmental resistance is limited. That means there's not too many biotic and abiotic factors that are going to limit or control how that population grows. So in any population, what we would say addition and subtraction. So addition would be the birth and immigration, and subtraction would be death and immigration. Death, addition and subtraction occur all the time. The population will fluctuate. Some populations fluctuate widely, and others fluctuate very little. A population is said to be at equilibrium when a population can restore its number after a small disturbance, and the ecosystem's capacity, that means the ability to provide everything that the organisms in that population needs, is not exceeded. So what limit population size? The first things that limit the population size is the population density, or the number of individuals per area. If you have too many individuals or too many organisms of the same species, they won't find any place to live. They won't find a good habitat. What we call density-dependent limiting factors, this increase with the population density. So what is known is that disease, predation, or food shortage, this increase as the population becomes much larger. And disease, predation, food shortage are part of the environmental resistance. Overall, when the environmental resistance becomes very high, mortality also becomes very high. And then you have density independent factors. So those are factors that have an effect on the density of on the population, but is not due to the density of the population. So for example, you have a fire that occurs or some kind of major disturbance. This is not, it's something that happens randomly. And it's not involved with maintaining the population equilibrium. So how is the population equilibrium maintained? There are two types of density-dependent factors that can regulate a population. You have the logistic growth, so the maximum carrying capacities of the ecosystem. And then you have the mechanism of top-down regulation. So typically that's when your predator control a population of prey. And then you have the bottom-up regulation. Typically, it's when you have the food source that is limiting the population of the organisms that rely on that food source. So in natural system, a species can experience both top-down and bottom-up control. So for the rest of that presentation, we are going to look at those top-down and bottom-up regulation, and we're going to focus on the interaction between organisms to explain what is top-down and bottom-up regulation. In natural ecosystem, you have about 6 different types of major interaction between species, between two different species. The interaction can be defined as either being positive, which we are going to represent with the sign plus in the table, or negative, that would be a negative sign, or being completely neutral, like there is no impact on the organisms. So positive and negative effects, they are the result of what we call symbiosis. Symbiosis is simply the relationship in which the life of two species are closely connected, and that can be in a positive way or a negative way. So we are going to review that in the next slide. So quite often when we think about interaction between organisms, the first one that came in mind is predation. So predation is positive for the organisms who eat the other one and negative for the one who is eaten. The predator is the one that does the feeding. The prey is the one that is being fed upon. So prey-predators interaction, typically you have them between carnivores. So carnivores are organisms that eat meat, and herbivores are organisms that eat plants, and then carnivores can eat herbivores. So herbivore, once again, they feed on plants. Another type of predation is the one when a parasite feed on its own. A parasite is considered a predator. A parasite is, by definition, an organism. It can be a plant or an animal that feeds on its prey, typically or usually without killing it. And the host is the organisms that is being fed upon. So that would be the prey. Example of predators include tapeworm, disease-causing bacteria, viruses, fungi. Viruses, we need to be cautious. Viruses are not considered as living things, but in ecosystem, they are considered at the same level as parasites. So parasite can affect their host population, and it's typically in a density-dependent way. Parasite and their vectors. Vectors are organisms that carry the parasite but don't necessarily suffer from the presence of the parasite. Parasite and their vectors can find new hosts for the parasite when you have population of hosts that have very, very high densities. And then pathogens, again, those are disease-causing bacteria, those are living things, and viruses. Viruses are not living things. Ecologically, again, they are not different from parasites, and they're actually considered as highly specialized parasites. That means they are typically limited to a very, very short number of hosts. So let's look at a more traditional, if we may say, prey-predator relationship. So prey and predators, the predators are very, very important because they regulate the population of their prey. And this is very important in particular when the prey is an herbivore. So this type of regulation is called the top-down control. If we look at an example, for example, the population of moose in Ile Royale in Lake Superior. So Ile Royale is right there, or right there when we zoom on it. This ecosystem is very interesting. So this ecosystem has moose and wolf. Without the wolf, the population of moose increased very, very rapidly. And then when the wolf comes into the island, the wolf will prey on the moose. The wolf population will increase, and in parallel or in contrast, you will see the moose population going down. And then when the wolf population goes down, the moose population will increase. So those two organisms pretty much regulate each other. What's very interesting about the Ile Royale, we can follow the wolf population. The wolf can come from Canada over the winter when the lake is frozen. If it's frozen all the way to the island, the wolf can basically walk to the island and then will stay there. And then some wolves have been known to stay there for quite some time. And you have a lot of studies that have been conducted. It's a very interesting ecosystems. As you can imagine, there is not a lot of wolves that can walk across the ice to get to Ile Royale. So what happened is that you kind of have like a genetic bottleneck in the wolf population. If those wolves are carrying some kind of genetic disorder, after a few generations, you will see that pretty much all the organisms in the island can carry that disorder. And that also impacts the dynamic prey-predator. But when we really try to summarize what's happening, the more wolf you have, you will have a high environmental resistance and you will have a lot less wolves. The less wolf, the smaller the environmental resistance, the higher the population of wolves. So what is also very interesting in this ecosystem is that it's not just the wolf and the moose. So the wolf population is actually pretty small. So genetically, it's very interesting. And then the environments play a very important role in the survival of the moose. For example, if you have a lot of deep snow, it can limit the access to the food for the moose over the winter. And then in contrast, the years when the temperature are too high over the winter, typically you have very high winter tick infestations. And those ticks, so remember, ticks are part of predators as well in the ecological sense. Those ticks can be really damaging to the population of moose, especially for the calves. And the calves are the preferred prey, moose prey for the wolf. So if the wolf cannot capture enough calves, this also impact the population of wolves. So the tick indirectly also impact the population of wolf. So it's really very interesting. If you have, so here the moose has two top-down type of regulation, and then a bottom-up type of regulation with access to food. And then when you have a lot of infection, a lot of tick, other parasites can come in and further impact the population of moose. So why are those prey-predator relationships so important? Well, we know that when the herbivores are not regulated, when the herbivore populations are not regulated or controlled, they can quickly overgraze the plants. So what does this mean is that overgrazing is when you have herbivores that eat the plant faster than they can actually regenerate or grow. So when the plants are depleted, then the animals will also, that depend on them, will also suffer. One of those, one example is, you guys probably heard of the St. Matthew Island. St. Matthew Island is an island, a small island between Alaska and Russia. In 1944, about 29 healthy reindeer were introduced by humans in the island. And then in a matter of a decade or less, the population increased from 29 to over 6,000. So when that happened, when that population increased that fast, we call that an overshoot. By when the population reached 6,000, the pressure or the overgrazing on plants was so high that the deer could not find any plants to survive on. And then after a couple of very tough winters and the lack of food, by 1966, so about 20 years later, only 42 reindeers had remained on the island. So that's one example of what overgrazing can do. That's pretty extreme. Today, we know that the livelihood of people relies on livestock animals, and we know that about 20% of the rangelands around the world are currently overgrazed. So what we call rangelands, it's basically any natural or semi-natural area that are mostly covered by grass or small shrubs or small trees. So you find them like in grassland, in savannas, some part of the desert, like the picture here on the slide, some tundra. Those rangelands are basically about a fifth of them today on Earth are overgrazed. So when you have this type of environmental resistance, you don't have enough plants to sustain the animals that rely on them. Ultimately, all those organisms are going to suffer. What happens when we disrupt those relationships, the prey-predator relationship? So when you remove a predator or when you disrupt the life of a predator, there is not enough predators in an ecosystem. When that happens, you will really upset the relationship between plants and herbivores. One example is in the Kaibab Plateau. You guys probably already know that story. Wolves, mountain lions, bears, all of those top predators or all those predators were removed in the early 1900s. When humans removed those predators, the idea was to basically have an area where you could hunt for livestock, for deers. We killed them because we thought that we would get more big game to hunt, and also we thought that they were a threat to livestock and humans. And then in the Kaibab Plateau, again, we observed the same phenomena as the one that we described in St. Matthew Island. You had an overshoot, so the population of deers quickly expand. We had signs that those population of deer were suffering very early on. We could see that some fawns were starting to starve or were underweight and so on. And then by 1925, the population of deer drastically decreased. Today we know that in order to maintain a healthy population of deer, we need to control the number of deer. So today, rangers are maintaining the population at about 10,000 deer in this area. Quite a few of the predators actually came back. The wolf did not come back, but I think the bobcats came back, the mountain lions came back. So when that happens, when you have an overshoot, you know that you have a population that is suffering and is overgrazing when you have overshoot in your herbivores. And typically, the only organisms that can overshoot are your herbivores. Another good example that you guys are going to investigate on your own is the example of the wolf of Yellowstone. Very similar story to the Kaibab story. In the early 1900s, the wolf, the bears, other mountain lions, all those predators, coyotes were also removed. The population of deers increased, damaged the vegetation. And then it wasn't until the reintroduction in this time of the wolf in the mid 1990s, so around 1994, that we saw the population of deer decrease, and then the population could recover, the vegetation could recover. And this, in your investigation later today, in your class activity, you will see that the reintroduction of the wolf is today we believe that it really helped the whole ecosystem beyond population of deer. The deer population is much healthier. The beavers benefited from it. The bears benefited from it. So those observations that were made in the San Mateo Island, in the Kaibab Plateau, in Yellowstone, all of that really help us understand the importance of certain species in the ecosystem. We call those species the keystone species. We know that they are extremely important. Dr. Payne in the 1970s, he proposed the green world hypothesis. Today we have organisms like plants which can capture the energy from the sun and pass it on to animals. Dr. Payne proposed that in order to regulate the population of herbivores, you have to have predators. So every species, even the one that we thought was threatening, like the wolf or the bears, every species play a very important role in the ecosystem. And what we call the ketone species are actually species that, even if they are not very abundant in terms of number of individuals, when you remove them, the entire ecosystem can collapse. So Dr. Payne did a lot of work. You may be familiar with his work on the starfish. His work with the sea otter in the US West Coast. With the starfish and the sea otter, he saw that when you remove them from the ecosystem basically collapse because there is nothing that control predation or grazing activities of other organisms like sea urchins. If we look at the example of the sea otters eat the sea urchins, and then that protects the kelp forests. And the kelp forests are extremely important for many, many organisms to survive. They provide habitat, they provide food. The sea urchin is an extremely efficient herbivore of kelp. So if you don't have anything that controls the sea urchins, basically you decimate the kelp forests. So now that we discussed the importance of the prey-predator relationship, we can look at other type of interaction that are also very important. We're going to look at competitions. When two organisms compete for the same resource, that resource is said to be scarce, and then both organisms are going to be affected by that. No organisms really win. You can have intraspecific competition. This is when members of the same species are competing for the same resource. This can lead to this can be caused by density-dependent regulation. For example, you have two organisms that compete for the same territory, or you have two organisms that compete for the same mate. Only the fittest will survive. So when two organisms of the same species compete, let's say for a mate, this can lead to evolutionary change. Only the fittest will survive. So over time, a population that has, if you have individuals that have better adaptation, better traits to survive, they are going to pass on their traits. If you have organisms that compete for territory, only the organisms that can compete for the resource are going to survive and pass on their traits. So this is typically intimidation or worse. Some species do not have territoriality. Other species have develop other strategy. For example, they will increase the amount of offspring. And then in other instances, competition takes place between organisms of different species. Typically, this type of interaction, different species cannot survive if they compete for the same resource. One species is either going to have to leave the area or the species is going to have to occupy different niche. So occupying different niche, it's basically relying on different resource. Even if it's the same area, it's resource partitioning. We have an example here in the warblers, the American warblers, North American warblers. You can have 5 or more different species of warblers that live on the same tree, but if you look carefully, each species will rely on specific resources, and the resources they can or cannot overlap, but it's the species try to avoid having to compete for the same resource. And then in some instance, when species are or when organisms from an original species are competing for the same resource, and then become more and more specific to a type of niche or a type of habitat, those species are going to develop adaptation or traits that are going to be extremely efficient for the habitat in which they live to get the resource from those habitats. A very good example is the finch of Darwin's. If you look at the species of finch that live on the same island, so for example, the Isabella Island, here you have several species that live in different niche, or you have finches who basically move to like specific island, and then they will develop traits and characteristics, have traits and characteristics that are typical for, that are unique to each island. So here on this island here, on Santa Cruz, you have, Santa Cruz is here, it's a pretty large island. You have 2 species with different beak size. So those 2 species rely on different resources. And then in Daphne, which is much smaller, where is Daphne? Right there. It's this tiny one right there. All the finch here are the same species, and they have a very specific beak. The resource between Santa Cruz and Daphne are different, so the beak of all 3 species are different. And then here we have the species of the island of Los Hermanos, which is right there, also very specific. And again, the finch have developed their own traits to survive here. Another type of symbiotic interaction between organisms is mutualism. So mutualism, when you have a mutualistic interaction, both organisms benefit from the interaction. So pollinators are a very good example of what mutualism is. Fungi on roots are also another example. Fungi typically provide the plants, the tree typically, with some nutrients and water, and then in exchange, the roots can provide some nutrition to the plants as well. So they release exudate that the fungi can use. Lichen is an association between algae and fungi. Both organisms benefit from the interaction. The anemone fish is also an example. It protects the anemone from predation, while the anemone also protects the fish from predation. So commensalism and amensalisms are the last two types of relationship between organisms. For example, so the commensalisms is an interaction between when one species benefit and the other one is unaffected, so it's not hurt, but it does not benefit either. Here we have an example here on the slide. We can see the buffalo and the egret. The buffalo, the egret will actually benefit from the interaction by feeding on the insect that is stirred up by the buffalo. Another example, the buffalo does not really benefit from the interaction. If the egrets leave, the buffalo is going to be just fine. Another example are orchids. Orchids live on trees. They are epiphytes. If you remove the orchid from the tree won't be harmed. However, if the orchid doesn't have a tree to live on, it won't survive. And then amensalism, this one is when one species is harmed while the other isn't affected. So that can happen when you have natural compounds that are released by some plants. They can, for example, the black walnut trees, the root release chemicals that can kill other plants. Or that happens, for example, another example that might be easier to understand is when you have, for example, an elephant that steps on a plant. The elephant is not going to be harmed, but the plant that is being stepped on is likely to die. So organisms that are being harmed by relationship with other organisms, so that would be mostly your prey-predation relationship. The organisms that are being harmed, they change and adapt to their predators. In other words, the idea is to survive. Any traits or any characteristic that will help an organism to survive and reproduce better is a force that will this is called natural selection, and this is a force that will make organism change, what we call evolution. So predators and prey become adapted to each other. You have interspecific competition will also drive evolution. Anything that is forcing an organism to change is basically a force for evolution. How do those adaptations come about? This is typically through change in the molecule of DNA. When you have in a population where most young that do not have the traits that help them survive, those youth are not going to survive. So it's really, really the result of selective pressure, what we call again the environmental resistance factors, and then those factors are affecting survival and reproduction. So if you have an organism that has a trait that protect them or allow them to escape, they can survive and they can reproduce and they will pass on their traits to the next generation. So natural selection, this is the process of having specific traits favoring the survival of certain individuals. Those traits are passed on to the next generation. Charles Darwin explained to us how it works. He published his work in a book called On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection in the mid-19th centuries. And then now we know today that biological evolution is basically the modification of the gene pool within a population, and that modification is a process that takes time. This is a process that occurs through mutation in the molecule of DNA. And those change we know support the theory of evolution by natural selection. So evolution, once again, is at the core of biology. Understanding how organisms can change is really what can explain the diversity of life on Earth today. So those change are the result of selective pressure in the environment, especially the environment resistance. Only the organisms that are the fittest can survive. If a trait increases survival and reproduction, this trait will help the individual survive and reproduce. It will be passed on to the next generation. So any environmental shows that force a species to adapt or migrate, if the species cannot adapt through natural selection or cannot find an environment that is more suitable for its traits and characteristics, that species will go extinct. So what does it take for a species to adapt to new conditions? You have to have individuals in a population that have the right traits, so the right combination or the right combination of genes to survive. And then there's got to have there got to be enough of the individual with that traits in order for them to survive and reproduce. If you have enough, if you have a breeding population, then natural selection can lead to increase in the frequency of those adaptations in the population in the successive generation. If that population cannot be maintained, that population will go extinct. So really to understand species survival, we need to look at 4 variables: geographic distribution, what is the degree of specialization to a given habitat or food supply, what is the genetic variation inside that population, do you have individuals with different traits, what is the rate of reproduction, and the air strategies population typically are less vulnerable because of the very high amount of progeny that they can produce. So for example, here we have 2 examples here. If you have a vulture, you guys probably recall, they are part of the decomposer group of organisms that are extremely specialized to their type of diet. If they really have a lot of limitation in what type of environment they can live. If you have any change in those environments, you're likely to see extinction. In contrast, an organism like the fly, where you have a lot of progeny, it's very small, can survive on many different types of diets, produce a lot of offspring, is more likely to survive. So when we think about evolution, when we think about the impact that the environment has on an organism and the interaction of these organisms with other population in the ecosystem, we need to realize that population, not individuals in that population, but population is what change, is what is evolving, what is changing. New adaptation, new traits appears in the population over multiple generation. Those new traits are the result of genetic variation. So those are the result of mutation, crossing over, hybridization. It's really at the level of the molecule of DNA. If a particular population, through natural selection, can adapt to a changing environment, then it will exist, it will survive, it will be maintained. if the population cannot adapt or cannot adapt fast enough, that population will go extinct. And today, once again, we know that biodiversity is decreasing. We know that species or group of population, group of organisms are going extinct faster than new species are appearing. So adaptations to new conditions within population takes time. In some organism, it might look very different. That process might look very different than in other species. Once population has changed enough that he cannot breed and reproduce with other population of what is thought to be the original species, that population that is isolated now by reproduction is considered a new species. So plate tectonics also play a very important role in the process of evolution. We know that plate tectonics, the slow movement of Earth continent, has isolated population. Some of those plate tectonics movement have caused volcanoes and earthquake, which had isolated some population, and the subpopulation after isolation have evolved differently. They were not able to mate and share genetic pool anymore. And also over time, the movement of the plate tectonics has exposed the landmass to different climates. So when we think about the history of Earth, we know that the movement of plate tectonics, it's not sample, but the movement of plate tectonics itself is a vector of change and is also influencing evolution. So some example of landmass that were originally very connected to continents and other part of the world are like the Australia and the Indo-Australian tectonic plates. The movement of tectonic plates has isolated Australia probably, I mean, it's very ancient, very long time. And then in Australia, you have very unique species that are very unique to that country, only pretty much that continent. Same with for Indonesia, you have very unique species there. I mean, once you have isolation or formation of volcanic island that have not been in contact with other ecosystem and other biomes, you start seeing things that are very unique. So what does it mean for us? So today we know that some ecosystems are suffering as a result of our activities. You have in order to manage those ecosystems, you have more and more human management. So ecologists study population and communities. They study the richness of the communities, the number of species, and how many individuals do you have by species to understand the potential genetic variation. Ecologists are trying to better manage natural resources. We are doing a lot of study to understand the impact that our activities have on population. If you have mismanagement, you can have native species that can increase rapidly. They can completely overtake the ecosystem, kind of like invasive species. If you don't have the right bottom up and top down regulation, any species can basically invade an ecosystem. So invasive species, themselves can be a huge problem. We have multiple examples of accidental invasion, mice and rats that were brought by ships into island that never had any organisms like that before. We know that those rodents typically affect the native species, and the most endangered species would be birds. Kudzu was introduced, I think, in the early 2000s in the US, maybe before. They were introduced as a way to control erosion and as cattle feeder. Today, kudzu in the United States has kind of become out of control. It covers over 7 million acres of forest in the US. And you guys probably know that when your kudzu is present or is pretty much overtaking your tree, that tree is completely covered by kudzu and eventually will die because it cannot have access to light and do photosynthesis. Other examples include a jelly-like type of organisms that was introduced, for example, in the Black Sea. This jelly-like organisms attack larval fish, and then larger fish cannot feed on the larval fish. And then this has caused many fisheries to close. So this has a huge economic impact in addition to the ecological impact. So there are solutions that we can put in place. Agencies are trying to slow down and stop invasive species. This is done through regulation and also control, and then providing information. In some instances, natural enemies have been introduced as well, but this can be tricky. In a new ecosystem, any species can have a behavior that is completely different from what you see in another ecosystem. So a natural enemy of a specific species can become a problem itself. When you have organism, though, and something that we need to keep in mind is that environmental resistance is pretty powerful. Organism within an ecosystem has specific relationship. Those specific relationship are the results of evolution, coevolutions. When there is an organism that doesn't fit at all into those relationships, typically that organisms, that invasive species, typically won't be able to survive. So ecosystem resistance is a very powerful tool to prevent adverse effects of invasive species. But in some instances, the invasive species is winning and is taking over. And so when that happens, the invasive species will take the niche of another native species. So it will kill, it will remove those species. And then once that invasive species outcompetes native species for food space and other resources, you will observe the population shoot. And then typically once you have the population shoot, you also have the crash down. But the population shoot is the phase when the ecosystem that received the invasive species is being hurt. And then after that, after the crash down, things start to regulate. So you should now be able to describe what is population growth, what is exponential growth, and how it compares to the logistic growth. What is a critical number and what is carrying capacity. Explain how organisms interact, how they can change, and how ecosystem resist disturbance. You can also discuss the impact of an invasive species into ecosystems in relation to ecosystem resistance. The activities for this week, exam 1 should be is on Tuesday. You should be done with it. Remember, you have 2 other attempts if you're not satisfied with the grade that you had on Tuesday. You have a case studies that has been posted in Blackboard, The Wolf of Yellowstone. What happened in Yellowstone is extremely important. Today, we are still observing how the Yellowstone ecosystem is recovering. And then read chapter 4. It's just to make sure that you have everything and you understand everything about the relationship between population and communities. And then when you're ready, you can demonstrate your understanding with homework 4.